Little dog follows nurse to the hospital. When she understands the reason, she can't hold back her tears. Sarah Mitchell pushed through another exhausting 12-hour shift at Massachusetts General Hospital, her shoulders heavy with the weight of countless patient rounds. The autumn wind whistled through the streets of Boston as she adjusted her coat, preparing for the walk home to her apartment in Beacon Hill. The streetlights cast long shadows across the hospital's entrance, and the sound of distant sirens echoed through the city's narrow streets. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay with us. As she passed through the sliding glass doors of the emergency department, something caught her eye. A medium-sized dog, with honey-colored fur, stood perfectly still near the entrance, its intelligent eyes fixed directly on her. Sarah had seen plenty of strays during her late-night walks home, but this one was different. There was an almost human-like awareness in its gaze, an intentionality that made her pause for a moment. The dog wasn't dirty or unkempt, like most strays. Its coat, though not perfectly groomed, suggested it belonged to someone. But what struck Sarah most was its behavior. No begging, no approaching for food or attention. It simply watched her with an unwavering focus that sent a slight shiver down her spine. "Go home," she called out softly, adjusting her bag on her shoulder and continuing her walk. The click of claws on concrete told her the dog had other plans. It maintained a respectful distance, but followed her with determined precision. Every few steps, Sarah glanced back, expecting the dog to lose interest and wander off, but it remained steadfast in its pursuit. The streets of Boston were quieter than usual, with only a few late-night workers and students hurrying past. The dog's presence behind her became increasingly difficult to ignore. At the intersection of Charles Street, Sarah stopped at a red light, and the dog did something unexpected. Instead of maintaining its distance, it moved closer, looking up at her with those same knowing eyes, before turning and trotting back in the direction they'd come. Sarah stood frozen, watching the dog retreat. Something about its behavior tugged at her medical instincts. The same gut feeling that had helped her diagnose countless patients throughout her career. The dog stopped, looked back at her and barked once, clearly expecting her to follow. "This is crazy," Sarah muttered to herself, but her feet were already moving. The dog led her through the familiar streets, its pace quickening as they approached the hospital. As they rounded the corner near the emergency entrance, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. There, slumped against the wall in a dimly lit corner, was a figure she recognized immediately. Walter Thompson, a 78-year-old patient. She'd treated the previous week for heart complications. He'd been living alone since his wife's passing 3 years ago, and Sarah had worried about his discharge, but he'd insisted he could manage on his own. The dog rushed to Walter's side, nudging his hand and whining softly. Sarah's nursing training kicked in immediately as she ran to check his vital signs. His pulse was weak but present, his skin clammy to the touch. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and called the emergency response team. "I need a gurney at the east entrance immediately," she commanded into the phone, her free hand already loosening Walter's collar. Patient with a history of cardiac issues, unconscious but breathing. The emergency team burst through the doors moments later, efficiently transferring Walter onto a gurney and rushing him inside. The dog attempted to follow but was stopped by hospital policy. It sat determinedly by the entrance, its eyes fixed on the doors through which they'd taken its owner. Sarah stood there, catching her breath, her mind racing to process what had just happened. The dog, Walter's dog, she now realized, hadn't been following her randomly. It had recognized her, perhaps from Walter's previous hospital stay, and specifically sought her out for help. The intelligence and loyalty displayed by this animal left her speechless. As the emergency team worked to stabilize Walter inside, Sarah found herself unable to leave the dog waiting alone in the cold. She approached it slowly, noticing for the first time the worn leather collar around its neck. The tag read, Charlie, with Walter's address engraved below. "You're quite something, aren't you, Charlie?" she said softly, kneeling beside him. The dog, Charlie, turned to look at her, and in that moment, Sarah felt a connection she couldn't explain. This wasn't just any dog. This was a being capable of extraordinary understanding and devotion. Making a quick decision, Sarah called the night shift supervisor to explain she'd be staying late to monitor Walter's condition. Then she went to her locker and retrieved the granola bar she'd saved for her walk home. Charlie accepted it gently, but his attention never strayed far from the hospital doors. As the night deepened and the emergency department's rhythm continued its steady pulse, Sarah sat on a bench outside, Charlie's head resting against her leg. She couldn't help but wonder about the bond between this remarkable dog and his elderly owner, and how many other stories of silent heroism and loyalty went unnoticed in the busy streets of Boston. The following days brought a whirlwind of changes to Sarah's routine. After that fateful night, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Charlie alone, so she'd taken him home to her small but cozy apartment on Myrtle Street. The building's no-pet policy was quickly waived when she explained the extraordinary circumstances to her landlord, Mrs. Henderson, who turned out to be a sucker for both dogs and heartwarming stories. Charlie adapted to her home with remarkable ease, as if he'd been there all along. But Sarah noticed something peculiar about his behavior. He seemed to have an almost supernatural awareness of time and routine. Every morning, precisely at 7, he would wake her with a gentle nudge, exactly when her alarm was set to go off. During her shifts at the hospital, he would sit by the window, his eyes fixed in the direction of Mass General, maintaining what Sarah could only describe as a silent vigil. Walter's condition had stabilized, but he remained under close observation. The doctors had discovered that his collapse had been caused by an irregular heartbeat, a condition that could have been fatal if Charlie hadn't acted so quickly. As Sarah made her rounds, she often found herself sharing the story with her colleagues, each making the dog's actions seem more remarkable. "I've never heard anything like it," Dr. James Morrison, the chief of cardiology, commented during rounds. "That dog didn't just know his owner needed help, he knew exactly who to ask for it. Makes you wonder what else they understand that we don't give them credit for." Sarah's colleagues started calling Charlie the guardian angel of Mass General, a title that seemed to amuse the dog whenever he heard it. During her breaks, Sarah would sit in the hospital garden with her phone, showing Walter photos and videos of Charlie, watching the elderly man's face light up with each new update. "He was a rescue, you know," Walter shared during one of their conversations, his voice still weak but filled with pride. "Found him at the shelter 3 years ago, right after I lost my wife. The shelter staff said he'd been there for months, passed over because he was too quiet, too serious. But when I saw him, something just clicked." As Walter spoke, Sarah noticed how his vital signs strengthened, how the simple act of talking about Charlie seemed to infuse him with new energy. She learned that Walter had been a professor of literature at Boston University, retiring only when Eleanor's illness required his full attention. After her passing, Charlie had become his sole companion, the only one who could pull him out of his grief. "Sometimes," Walter continued, his eyes distant with memory, "I swear he knows what I'm thinking before I do. There are days when I'm feeling down, and he'll bring me one of Eleanor's old books, as if he knows that's exactly what I need." Back at her apartment, Sarah began to understand what Walter meant. Charlie displayed an uncanny ability to anticipate her needs. On particularly stressful days, he would greet her at the door with her favorite slippers in his mouth. When she was engrossed in paperwork, he would gently remind her to take breaks by placing his paw on her hand. One evening, while reviewing Patient files on her laptop, Sarah found herself diving into research about dog behavior and intelligence. The more she read, the more fascinated she became. Studies showed that dogs could understand human emotions, predict seizures, and even detect certain illnesses. But Charlie seemed to possess something beyond these documented abilities, a kind of emotional intelligence that defied explanation. Her research was interrupted by a soft whine from Charlie. He stood by the door, his posture alert, ears perked forward. Sarah had learned to trust these signals. Something was wrong. She grabbed her coat and keys, following Charlie down to the street. To her surprise, he led her directly to Mrs. Henderson's apartment, where they found the elderly landlady sitting on her steps, clutching her chest and trying to catch her breath. "I was just coming to call for help," Mrs. Henderson wheezed, as Sarah immediately began checking her vital signs. "How did you know?" Sarah looked at Charlie, who sat calmly nearby, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Henderson. "Let's just say I have a very special early warning system," she replied, already dialing 911. As they waited for the ambulance, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was this another coincidence? Or was there something more to Charlie's extraordinary awareness? The hospital corridors felt different now that Sarah knew the full story behind Walter and Charlie's relationship. During her evening rounds, she found herself spending extra time in Walter's room, listening to tales of his life with Eleanor and how Charlie had become his anchor after her departure. Each story revealed layers of connection that went far beyond the typical bond between a pet and its owner. Eleanor always wanted a dog, Walter shared one evening, his voice stronger than it had been in days. But with her condition and all the medications, we never thought it would be possible. Then, after she was gone, I found myself at the shelter. I wasn't even planning to adopt. I just needed somewhere to be that wasn't our empty house. Sarah settled into the chair beside his bed, noting how his vitals improved whenever he talked about Charlie. "What made you choose him?" she asked, genuinely curious about the beginning of their extraordinary connection. Walter's eyes crinkled with the memory. He was sitting in the corner of his kennel, watching everyone pass by, not barking, not jumping around like the other dogs, just observing. When our eyes met, he stood up and placed his paw against the glass, like he was reaching out to shake my hand. Walter chuckled softly. The shelter staff couldn't believe it. They said he'd never done that with anyone else. As Walter spoke, Sarah remembered Charlie's similar behavior at her apartment, how he seemed to understand exactly what she needed, sometimes before she knew herself. Just that morning, he had retrieved her spare stethoscope from her bag moments before she realized she'd left her regular one at the hospital. "The first night I brought him home," Walter continued, "he went straight to Eleanor's reading chair and pulled down her favorite throw blanket. I thought he was just being mischievous, but he brought it to me and sat there until I wrapped it around myself. Somehow he knew exactly what I needed, a piece of her comfort." Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. "Has he always been able to sense things, like he did when you needed help?" Walter's expression grew thoughtful. "It started small at first. He'd bring me my blood pressure medication before I even remembered it was time to take it. Then he began anticipating my dizzy spells, pushing me toward a chair before they hit. But what amazes me most is how he seems to understand emotions, not just mine, but everyone's." Sarah thought about Charlie's behavior at her apartment, how he'd known about Mrs. Henderson's distress despite being floors away. "I've noticed that too," she admitted. "It's like he has a sixth sense about people in need." "The neighbors used to think I was crazy," Walter said with a slight smile. Charlie would suddenly start acting agitated, and next thing we knew, someone in the building needed help. Mrs. Peterson from 3B still brings him cookies every week because he alerted me when her grandson was having an allergic reaction. As they talked, Sarah noticed Walter's dinner tray sitting untouched. You should try to eat something, she suggested gently. The sooner you regain your strength, the sooner you can go home. Walter glanced at the hospital food with minimal enthusiasm. I know, it's just everything tastes like cardboard in here. At home, Charlie would always sit with me during meals, somehow made everything taste better. Sarah had an idea. What if I brought him to visit? I know it's against hospital policy, but given the circumstances... The hope that lit up Walter's face confirmed she'd made the right suggestion. Could you? Even for a few minutes? Leave. It to me, Sarah assured him. I'll talk to Dr. Morrison. After everything that's happened, I think we can make an exception for Charlie. He's practically an honorary staff member anyway. That evening, as Sarah walked home through the crisp Boston air, her mind was full of possibilities. She'd seen the healing power of animal therapy before, but Charlie seemed to operate on a completely different level. His abilities went beyond simple companionship. There was an almost prescient quality to his awareness that defied explanation. Climbing the stairs to her apartment, Sarah could hear Charlie's excited whine before she even reached the door. As she turned the key, she found him waiting with her slippers, as usual. But tonight there was something different about his demeanor. He seemed more animated, almost eager to communicate something. "What is it, boy?" she asked, kneeling. Down to his level, Charlie responded by running to her bag and nosing at the side pocket where she kept her phone. As she reached for it, it began to ring, the hospital's number flashing on the screen. Somehow, Charlie had known they would be calling, just as he'd known about everything else. The phone call from the hospital brought unexpected news. Walter's condition had shown significant improvement, but his doctors wanted to keep him under observation for a few more days. As Sarah hung up, she noticed Charlie's behavior had changed. He sat by her feet, tail wagging slowly, with what could only be described as a knowing look in his eyes. "You really do understand everything, don't you?" she mused, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. The events of the past few days had challenged everything she thought she knew about animal intelligence. As a medical professional, she'd always relied on science and observable facts, but Charlie's abilities seemed to transcend rational explanation. The next morning, Sarah woke early to implement her plan. She'd spoken with Dr. Morrison about allowing Charlie to visit Walter, and after some discussion about the therapeutic benefits, he'd agreed to a supervised visit. However, as she prepared for work, Charlie's behavior caught her attention. Instead of his usual morning routine, he paced between her and the window, whining softly. "What's wrong?" she asked, watching as he pressed his nose against the glass, looking in the direction of the hospital. Years of nursing had taught Sarah to trust her instincts, and something about Charlie's demeanor set off warning bells in her mind. She quickly finished getting ready and left for work earlier than usual, Charlie trotting beside her with determined purpose. As they approached Massachusetts General, Charlie's pace quickened. Sarah had arranged for a volunteer to watch him, while she checked on Walter, but the dog had other plans. The moment they entered the hospital, he headed straight for the cardiac ward, as if he knew exactly where to go. Sarah had to jog to keep up with him. They found Walter's room in an unusual state of activity. A team of nurses surrounded his bed, monitoring machines that were showing irregular readings. Dr. Morrison looked up as Sarah entered, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Perfect timing," he said. "Mr. Thompson's heart rhythm started showing abnormalities about 20 minutes ago. We're adjusting his medication, but we could use your help. You seem to have a special rapport with him." Sarah approached the bed, Charlie close behind her despite the staff's surprised looks. Walter's face was pale, but his eyes lit up when he saw them. To everyone's amazement, the moment Charlie placed his head gently on Walter's hand, the monitors began showing improvement in his vital signs. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Morrison muttered, watching the readings stabilize. I've heard about the calming effect of therapy dogs, but this is remarkable. For the next hour, Charlie remained by Walter's bedside, his presence seeming to have a profound effect on the elderly man's condition. The medical staff watched in amazement as all of Walter's vital signs gradually returned to normal ranges. What was even more surprising was how Charlie seemed to know exactly when to move closer or pull back, as if he could read the monitors himself. "He's done this before," Walter explained weakly, his color slowly returning. "After Eleanor, when I had my first episode, he knew before anyone else that something was wrong. That's why I wasn't surprised when he went looking for help this time." Sarah sat in the chair beside the bed, observing the interaction between man and dog. Charlie's eyes never left Walter's face, and there seemed to be an unspoken communication flowing between them. The dog's behavior was unlike anything she'd seen in her years of nursing. It went beyond simple companionship or even trained medical alert responses. As the day progressed, more hospital staff found excuses to pass by Walter's room, each wanting to witness the remarkable bond between the elderly patient and his canine guardian. Word spread quickly through the hospital about the dog who had not only saved his owner's life, but seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to monitor his condition. During her lunch break, Sarah found herself in deep conversation with Dr. Morrison about Charlie's abilities. "There's something special about this dog," the doctor admitted, watching through the window as Charlie maintained his vigilant post by Walter's bed. "I've worked with therapy animals before, but this is different. It's as if he has a direct line to Mr. Thompson's vital signs." Sarah shared some of her observations from the past few days, including the incident with Mrs. Henderson. "It's not just Walter," she explained. "Charlie seems to have a sixth sense about anyone in distress, and he knows exactly who to alert. And when." Dr. Morrison stroked his chin thoughtfully. "You know, there's a research program at Harvard Medical studying animal cognition and empathy. They might be very interested in documenting Charlie's abilities. Of course, that would be up to Mr. Thompson." Before Sarah could respond, Charlie's sudden movement caught their attention. The dog had risen from his spot and was staring intently at the heart monitor, his ears perked forward. Seconds later, the machine began showing subtle changes in Walter's rhythm, nothing critical, but enough to warrant attention. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to life at Massachusetts General. With Dr. Morrison's approval, Charlie had been granted special permission to stay in Walter's room during visiting hours, wearing a makeshift volunteer badge that the nursing staff had created specially for him. The effect on Walter's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. "His recovery rate has doubled since we allowed the dog to stay," Dr. Morrison explained during rounds, showing Sarah the latest test results. "Blood pressure stabilized, heart rhythm more consistent, even his appetite has improved. Whatever that dog is doing, it's better than half our medications." Sarah watched through the window as Walter shared his breakfast with Charlie, sitting attentively by his side. The elderly man looked more animated than she'd seen him since his admission, gesturing as he told stories to a group of young nurses who had gathered in his room. Charlie's presence seemed to have transformed the entire atmosphere of the cardiac ward. "It's not just Mr. Thompson," Nurse Jenny Martinez commented, joining Sarah at the window. "Have you noticed how Charlie responds whenever any patient on the floor is in distress? Yesterday, he alerted us to Mrs. Klein's anxiety attack before her monitors even picked up the change in her vital signs." Sarah nodded, remembering how Charlie had risen suddenly from his spot by Walter's bed, walking to the doorway and whining softly until someone followed him to check on the patient 3 doors down. The dog's intuition had become something of a legend among the hospital staff. During her lunch break, Sarah found herself in the hospital cafeteria with Dr. Morrison, discussing Charlie's impact on the ward. "The research team from Harvard is very interested," he said, sliding a business card across the table. They've never documented anything quite like this. The way he anticipates medical events, his ability to detect changes in patient conditions, it's unprecedented. What would that mean for Walter and Charlie? Sarah asked, thinking about the deep bond between the pair. Nothing invasive, Dr. Morrison assured her. Just observation and documentation. They're particularly interested in Charlie's ability to detect subtle changes in human physiology. Could be groundbreaking for early detection research. As they talked, Sarah felt a familiar nudge at her knee. Charlie had appeared beside their table, his expression urgent. Without a word, both she and Dr. Morrison stood, following the dog as he led them back to the cardiac ward. They found Walter experiencing mild discomfort. Nothing serious, but Charlie had detected it before it could escalate. How does he do that? One of the residents asked in amazement, watching as Charlie settled back into his spot, eyes fixed on Walter's face. I've stopped trying to explain it, Walter replied, his discomfort already easing. After Eleanor, well, let's just say, Charlie has been more than a pet. He's been my guardian angel. He reached out to scratch behind Charlie's ears, and the dog leaned into his touch with obvious affection. Later that afternoon, Sarah was completing her paperwork when she noticed Charlie's behavior change. He stood by the window, tail wagging slightly, looking down at the hospital entrance. Moments later, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, Mrs. Henderson, Sarah's landlady, carrying a basket of homemade treats. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, smiling as Charlie greeted her with gentle enthusiasm. I wanted to thank my early warning system properly. She placed the basket on Walter's bedside table, and the aroma of freshly baked cookies filled the room. Mrs. Henderson had a close call last week, Sarah explained to Walter. Charlie knew she needed help before anyone else did. Walter nodded. Unsurprised, he's always had a sense about these things. When he first came to live with me, I thought I was imagining it. But then he started alerting me to problems before they happened. Not just mine, but the neighbors too. It was like having a guardian angel watching over the whole building. As Mrs. Henderson settled into a chair, sharing stories about her own experiences with remarkable animals, Sarah observed the scene with growing amazement. Charlie moved between the three of them, offering comfort and attention where needed, his presence somehow making the hospital room feel more like a cozy living room than a medical facility. The afternoon light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the floor, and Sarah realized something profound had changed in her own life since that fateful night when Charlie had chosen to follow her. The dog hadn't just saved Walter's life. He had created connections between people who might never have met otherwise, weaving a web of caring and support that extended far beyond his initial act of heroism. The evening shift at Massachusetts General was winding down when Sarah received an unexpected message from Walter. It was a simple, handwritten note delivered by one of the night nurses, but its contents made her heart skip a beat. In slightly shaky handwriting, Walter had expressed his gratitude not just for her medical care, but for understanding the extraordinary bond he shared with Charlie. There's something I need to show you, the note concluded. Something that might help explain why Charlie is the way he is. Sarah found herself intrigued. She had just finished her rounds and technically could head home, but curiosity got the better of her. Making her way to Walter's room, she found him sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in days. Charlie lay at his feet, but rose to greet her with his usual gentle enthusiasm. I've been thinking, Walter began, gesturing for her to take a seat, about how to explain Charlie's abilities. The truth is, there's more to his story than I initially shared. He reached for a worn leather journal on his bedside table, its pages clearly well-thumbed and marked with numerous sticky notes. Eleanor, my wife, was a researcher at MIT, he continued, his voice soft with memory. She specialized in animal cognition and emotional intelligence. This was her research journal. He carefully opened the book, revealing pages of neat handwriting interspersed with diagrams and observations. Before she left us, she was working on a groundbreaking study about dogs' ability to detect changes in human physiology. Not just obvious things like seizures or blood sugar levels, but subtle emotional and physical changes that even medical equipment sometimes misses. Sarah leaned forward, fascinated. "Is that why you chose Charlie from the shelter?" Walter smiled, shaking his head. "Actually, I think Charlie chose me. You see, he was one of the dogs in Eleanor's study. She had noted him as having extraordinary abilities, even compared to the other dogs in the program. But after she passed, the study was discontinued, and Charlie ended up in the shelter." As if aware he was being discussed, Charlie raised his head, his intelligent eyes moving between Sarah and Walter. The elderly man reached down to pat him gently. "I didn't know any of this when I adopted him," Walter continued. "I was just drawn to his calm presence. It wasn't until I found Eleanor's old research notes that I realized who he was. By then, he had already saved me from several cardiac episodes I didn't even know were coming." Sarah glanced at the journal, her medical. Curiosity piqued. "May I?" she asked, reaching for it. Walter nodded, and she began carefully turning the pages, absorbing Eleanor's detailed observations and theories. "Look at this entry," Walter said, pointing to a particular page. She documented Charlie's ability to detect emotional distress in strangers, even through walls. She believes some dogs possess a form of empathic intelligence that we're only beginning to understand. As they discussed Eleanor's research, Charlie suddenly lifted his head, his attention focused on the door. Moments later, they heard rapid footsteps in the hallway. A young resident appeared, slightly out of breath. "Ms. Mitchell, we need you. In room 412, Mr. Rogers is experiencing anxiety about his upcoming procedure." Before Sarah could even stand, Charlie was already at the door, waiting expectantly. She looked at Walter, who nodded with understanding. "Go on," he said. That's what Eleanor would have wanted, Charlie helping as many people as possible. Together, Sarah and Charlie made their way to room 412, where they found an elderly patient in visible distress. The moment Charlie entered the room, his calming presence seemed to fill the space. He approached the bed slowly, placing his head gently on Mr. Rogers' hand. The effect was almost immediate. The patient's breathing began to slow, his tense shoulders relaxing. "Well, who's this?" he asked, managing a small smile as he stroked Charlie's soft fur. As Sarah explained Charlie's special role in the hospital, she couldn't help but think about Eleanor's research. Here was living proof of everything the scientist had documented. A dog with an extraordinary ability to sense and respond to human needs, bridging the gap between scientific observation and something that seemed almost magical. Back in her apartment that evening, Sarah sat, cross-legged on her couch, Eleanor's research journal spread open on her lap. Walter had insisted she borrow it, saying the information inside might help her better understand Charlie's extraordinary abilities. The dog lay nearby, occasionally, lifting his head to watch her as she turned the pages, as if he knew she was learning his secrets. Subject C demonstrates remarkable consistency in detecting pre-symptomatic changes in test subjects, one entry read. Unlike other dogs in the study, he appears to recognize not only physical distress, but emotional states as well. Most intriguingly, he shows the ability to differentiate between varying levels of urgency and seeks appropriate help accordingly. Sarah glanced at Charlie, remembering how he had specifically sought her out that first night, passing by other hospital staff to find her. According to Eleanor's notes, this wasn't random behavior. Charlie had shown the ability to identify the most appropriate person to help in any given situation. The journal entries became more excited as they progressed. Today, Subject C demonstrated something unprecedented. He not only detected Mr. Harrison's upcoming cardiac event, but appeared to understand the concept of preventive intervention. He led a nurse to check on the patient a full 30 minutes before any measurable symptoms appeared. This suggests a level of cognitive processing far beyond what we previously believed possible. As she read deeper into the journal, Sarah began to understand why Eleanor's research had been so groundbreaking. She wasn't just documenting a dog's ability to detect medical conditions. She was uncovering evidence of a type of intelligence that bridged the gap between instinct and reasoning. A soft whine from Charlie drew her attention. He stood by the window, his posture alert but not alarmed. Moments later, her phone buzzed with a text from the night nurse at the hospital. Walter was having trouble sleeping, but was otherwise stable. Charlie had known somehow that his owner was restless. "You really are something special, Aunt." "You?" Sarah murmured, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. Charlie leaned into her touch, his eyes wise and knowing. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, Eleanor's journal tucked safely in her bag. She found Walter awake and in good spirits, with Charlie already by his side. Dr. Morrison had arranged for a morning volunteer to bring him in early. "I read through most of the journal last night," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside Walter's bed. "It's fascinating. Eleanor's research could revolutionize how we think about animal intelligence and medical detection." Walter nodded, a mix of pride and melancholy crossing his face. That's what she always said. She believed dogs like Charlie could change the future of preventive medicine. But more than that, she understood they could bridge the gap between clinical care and emotional healing. As if to demonstrate this very point, Charlie suddenly rose and walked to the door. Moments later, a young patient in a wheelchair appeared, looking lost and anxious. The girl couldn't have been more than 12, and her face lit up when she saw Charlie. "Is this the special dog everyone's talking about?" she asked shyly, wheeling closer as Charlie gently approached her. "This is Charlie," Sarah confirmed, watching as the dog placed his head softly in the girl's lap. "He has a way of knowing when people need a friend." The girl's mother appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry. Emma wanted to see the dog she's been hearing about from the nurses." "No need to apologize," Walter said warmly. "Charlie seems to have made a new friend." As they watched Emma interact with Charlie, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The girl's anxious fidgeting had stopped and her breathing had become more relaxed. Just like Eleanor had documented in her journal, Charlie was providing exactly the type of comfort needed in the moment. "Eleanor would have loved this," Walter said softly, watching the scene unfold. "She always said Charlie's greatest gift wasn't just his ability to detect medical problems, but his understanding of what each person needed emotionally. Look at how gentle he is with Emma, how he knows exactly how to approach her." Sarah nodded, thinking about Eleanor's detailed observations. The journal had described similar scenarios, how Charlie would adjust his behavior based on the specific needs of each person he encountered. With some, he would be playful and engaging. With others, calm and still. It wasn't just instinct, it was a deep understanding of human emotion. Word about Charlie's extraordinary abilities had spread throughout Massachusetts General like wildfire. What started as a heartwarming story about a dog saving his owner had evolved into something much more significant. Medical staff from other departments began finding reasons to visit the cardiac ward, hoping to witness Charlie's remarkable intuition firsthand. One morning, as Sarah made her rounds, Dr. Morrison caught up with her in the hallway, his expression animated. "The hospital board is interested in establishing a permanent therapy dog program," he announced. "They've been watching Charlie's impact on patient recovery rates, and the data is impossible to ignore." Sarah smiled, remembering Eleanor's writings about the potential for dogs in medical settings. Walter would be thrilled to hear that. It's exactly what Eleanor was working toward with her research. As they talked, Charlie appeared at the end of the corridor, his behavior catching their attention. He stood alert, head tilted slightly, before trotting purposefully toward the elevator. Sarah and Dr. Morrison exchanged glances before following him. Charlie led them to the pediatric floor, where they found Emma, the young girl from the day before, experiencing an anxiety attack before a scheduled procedure. Before any of the medical staff could intervene, Charlie had already placed himself beside her wheelchair, his calming presence helping to regulate her breathing. "I don't understand," Emma's mother said, watching in amazement as her daughter's panic subsided. "How did he know? We're not even on the same floor as Mr. Thompson." Dr. Morrison pulled out his tablet, showing her Eleanor's research data that Sarah had shared with him. According to these studies, dogs like Charlie can detect subtle changes in human physiology through scent and other sensory inputs we're only beginning to understand. But Charlie seems to take it a step further. He not only detects these changes, but understands exactly who needs his help and how to provide it. As Emma calmed down, she kept one hand buried in Charlie's fur while the medical team prepared her for her procedure. "Can he stay with me?" she asked hopefully. "Just until I fall asleep." Sarah looked at Dr. Morrison, who nodded. "I think we can arrange that. Charlie seems to have chosen you as his patient for the moment." While Charlie accompanied Emma to her procedure, Sarah returned to Walter's room to update him. She found him sitting in a chair by the window, looking stronger than he had in days. "Charlie's expanding his practice," she joked, sharing the story of what had just happened. Walter beamed with pride. Eleanor always said he was special, even among the dogs in her study. She believed he could revolutionize how we think about animal-assisted therapy in medical settings. As they talked, Sarah noticed Walter fingering an envelope on his lap. "What's that?" she asked. "A letter I've been working on," he admitted, handing it to her. "For you, actually. I wanted to put into words how grateful I am, not just for saving my life, but for understanding what Charlie means to me, for seeing him the way Eleanor did." Sarah carefully opened the envelope, touched by the gesture. The letter inside was handwritten, each word carefully chosen. As she read, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. Walter had captured perfectly the magical connection that had formed between all of them. How one remarkable dog had brought together a lonely widower, a dedicated nurse, and an entire hospital community. "There's something else," Walter said, softly. "I've been thinking about Eleanor's research. It shouldn't stay hidden in an old journal. I want to share it with Dr. Morrison's team. Let them use it as a foundation for the new therapy dog program. It's what she would have wanted." Before Sarah could respond, Charlie returned from the pediatric floor, moving immediately to Walter's side and resting his head on his owner's knee. The bond between them was palpable, a connection that went beyond words or explanation. "You know," Walter continued, scratching behind Charlie's ears, "Eleanor used to say that the most remarkable thing about Charlie wasn't his ability to detect medical conditions. It was his understanding of human emotions, his capacity to bring people together. I didn't fully understand what she meant until now." The autumn days grew shorter, and the Boston air turned crisp with the promise of winter. But inside Massachusetts General, something extraordinary was blooming. Sarah noticed it in the small details, the way patients' faces lit up when they heard Charlie's gentle footsteps in the hallway, how the medical staff's shoulders would relax when he entered a room, the growing sense of community that had developed around Walter's recovery. One evening, as Sarah finished her shift, she found Walter sitting up in his bed, surrounded by papers and looking more energetic than she'd seen him in weeks. Charlie lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on his owner with those knowing eyes. I've been going through more of Eleanor's research, Walter explained, gesturing to the papers spread across his bed. There's so much here that could help people. She had theories about how dogs like Charlie process information, how they integrate different types of sensory input to create what she called emotional maps of their environment. Sarah pulled up a chair, intrigued. Is that how he knows who needs help and when? Exactly, Walter nodded, shuffling through the papers until he found a specific page. Look at this. Eleanor documented how Charlie could distinguish between different types of distress, physical pain, emotional anxiety, even the early stages of medical episodes. But more than that, he showed an understanding of urgency and appropriate response. As if to demonstrate this point, Charlie suddenly raised his head, his attention focused on the door. Moments later, they heard quick footsteps in the hallway. Emma's mother appeared, looking both excited and nervous. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but Emma's just gotten her test results back. Charlie seemed to know. He was waiting outside her room earlier and wouldn't leave until we promised to come tell you the news. Walter smiled warmly. Come in, please. Charlie's made it clear you're part of our little family now. As Emma's mother shared the good news about her daughter's improving condition, Sarah watched Charlie's behavior. He moved between each person in the room, offering exactly the right kind of attention to each. A gentle head bump for Emma's mother, a watchful presence near Walter, a calm steadiness beside Sarah. It's remarkable, Emma's mother said, wiping happy tears from her eyes. The doctors say Emma's recovery has been much faster than expected. They're attributing a lot of it to reduced stress levels, thanks to Charlie's visits. Walter nodded, unsurprised. Eleanor's research suggested that emotional well-being had a direct impact on physical recovery. She believed dogs like Charlie could bridge the gap between traditional medical care and emotional healing. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to head home, she found Dr. Morrison waiting by the nurses' station. I've been reviewing the proposal for the therapy dog program, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. The board is impressed with the data we've collected from Charlie's interactions with patients. But there's something else. He pulled out his tablet, showing her a series of charts. We've been tracking patient recovery rates, stress levels, even medication requirements. The numbers are remarkable. Patients who interact with Charlie regularly are showing significantly better outcomes across all metrics. Sarah thought about Eleanor's research, about all the observations and theories that had seemed so ahead of their time. Walter has more of Eleanor's research materials, she mentioned. She had documented similar findings, but no one was ready to take them seriously back then. Dr. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. Maybe that's why Charlie ended up at that shelter. Sometimes the world needs time to catch up to revolutionary ideas. He paused, watching as Charlie made his evening rounds, visiting each patient on the floor who needed comfort. But I think we're ready now. That night, as Sarah walked home with Charlie by her side, she reflected on how much had changed since that first evening when he'd followed her from the hospital. The streets were the same, the route identical, but everything else felt different. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She had become part of something larger, something that Eleanor had envisioned years ago. At her apartment, she found another envelope had been slipped under her door. Inside was a note from Mrs. Henderson, reporting that several other tenants in the building had noticed Charlie's calming effect during his short stays. They had started gathering in the courtyard during his evening walks, forming an impromptu community of their own. The morning Walter was scheduled to be discharged, Sarah arrived at the hospital to find the cardiac ward buzzing with activity. Staff members who had come to know and love Charlie over the past weeks stopped by to wish them well, each sharing a story about how the remarkable dog had touched their lives. I can't believe how much has changed, Walter said, sitting on the edge of his bed as Sarah helped him gather his belongings. Charlie sat nearby, his eyes moving between them with his characteristic alertness. When I first collapsed, I thought I was completely alone in the world. Now look at all this." He gestured to the cards and notes that had accumulated on his bedside table. Messages from patients, staff members, and even visitors who had witnessed Charlie's extraordinary abilities. Each one told a story of connection, of moments where Charlie's presence had made a difference. Dr. Morrison arrived with the discharge papers, but his usual professional demeanor was softened by emotion. "We're going to miss our unofficial therapy dog," he said, watching as Charlie made one last round of the nearby rooms, checking on patients he'd come to know. "Though I suppose with the new program starting, he'll be back to visit." "Eleanor would have loved that," Walter replied, his voice thick with feeling. "She always said hospitals needed more than just medical equipment and medications. They needed heart." As if understanding the significance of the moment, Charlie returned to Walter's side, pressing against his leg in a gesture of support. Sarah noticed how the dog positioned himself perfectly to provide balance as Walter stood, proving once again his incredible awareness of his owner's needs. "Before you go," Dr. Morrison said, pulling out a folder, "I wanted to show you something. We've been documenting Charlie's interactions with patients, correlating them with recovery rates and overall well-being. The results are remarkable." He spread several charts across the bed. Patient anxiety levels dropped significantly in his presence, recovery times improve, and we've even seen reduced need for certain medications. Walter smiled, unsurprised. Eleanor documented similar findings in her research. She believed dogs like Charlie could revolutionize patient care, not just through their ability to detect medical issues, but through their impact on emotional healing. As they discussed the findings, Charlie suddenly lifted his head, his attention focused on the door. Moments later, Emma appeared in her wheelchair, her mother pushing her. The young girl's eyes were bright with tears. "I heard you were leaving today," she said, wheeling closer to Walter and Charlie. "I wanted to say goodbye and thank you. The doctors say I can go home next week, and they think Charlie helped a lot with my recovery." Sarah watched as Charlie moved to Emma's side, placing his head gently in her lap. The dog's ability to provide exactly the right kind of comfort at the right moment never ceased to amaze her. "You know," Walter said thoughtfully, "I think Charlie's shown us all something important. It's not just about his ability to detect medical problems or provide comfort. It's about how he brings people together, creates connections where there were none before." Mrs. Henderson had arrived to help with the discharge process, and she nodded in agreement. "The building hasn't been the same since Charlie started. Staying there, people who lived next door for years without speaking are now friends. He's created a real community." As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The hallway had filled with hospital staff, patients and visitors, all gathered to say goodbye. Charlie moved among them, offering a gentle nuzzle. Here, a comforting presence there, somehow knowing exactly what each person needed. "Look at that," Walter said softly, watching the scene unfold. Eleanor used to say that the most powerful healing doesn't always come from medicine. Sometimes it comes from the connections we make with others, from knowing we're not alone. The transition from hospital to home brought its own kind of magic. Sarah had insisted on accompanying Walter and Charlie back to their apartment, carrying Eleanor's research materials, while Mrs. Henderson helped with the other belongings. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Walter's cozy Beacon Hill apartment, casting warm shadows across walls lined with bookshelves and framed photographs. Charlie moved through the space with purpose, checking each room before settling into what Sarah recognized as his surveillance position, a spot near the window that allowed him to monitor both Walter and the street below. The dog's attention never wavered, even as he appeared to be resting. "He's always like this the first few days after I've been away," Walter explained, settling into his favorite armchair, the one that Sarah noticed still had Eleanor's. throw blanket draped across its back. Extra vigilant, making sure everything's as it should be. Sarah arranged the medications on the kitchen counter, creating a clear schedule that would be easy to follow. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice how Charlie's eyes followed her movements, as if memorizing the routine. "I have a feeling he'll be reminding you when it's time to take these," she said with a smile. "Oh, undoubtedly," Walter chuckled. "He's better than any alarm clock. Eleanor used to joke that he could read time better than most humans." Mrs. Henderson, who had been arranging some fresh flowers in a vase, paused thoughtfully. "You know, since Charlie's been spending time in our building, I've noticed something interesting. People seem more aware of each other, more connected. Just yesterday, Mrs. Peters from the 4th floor brought soup to Mr. Rodriguez when she heard he wasn't feeling well. That never would have happened before." "That's Charlie's influence," Walter said proudly. Eleanor documented similar effects in her research. She called it the ripple effect, how one dog's empathy could inspire more compassionate behavior in humans. As they talked, there was a gentle knock at the door. Emma's mother stood in the doorway holding a homemade casserole. "The nurses told us you were coming home today," she explained, stepping inside. "Emma insisted we bring something to welcome you back." Charlie's tail wagged gently as he greeted her, but he didn't leave his post near Walter. His ability to balance attention between his primary responsibility and other social interactions continued to amaze Sarah. "We've been reading about therapy dogs," Emma's mother continued, setting the casserole in the kitchen. "After seeing Charlie's impact on Emma's recovery, we're looking into getting involved with the hospital's new program. We want to help create more of these connections for other patients." Walter's eyes lit up. Eleanor would have loved that. She always believed that understanding the human-animal bond could transform healthcare. She saw it as a bridge between traditional medicine and something more intuitive. As the afternoon progressed, more visitors arrived. Neighbors who had heard of Walter's return, hospital staff who had grown attached to Charlie, even Dr. Morrison stopped by briefly to check on his patient. Each person brought something: food, flowers, books, or simply their presence and good wishes. Sarah watched as Charlie navigated the steady stream of visitors, somehow maintaining his protective watch over Walter, while making each person feel acknowledged and welcomed. It was exactly what Eleanor had described in her research: the dog's ability to create a healing environment that extended beyond individual interactions. "You know," Walter said quietly to Sarah during a lull in the visits, "when I first adopted Charlie, I thought he was just going to be company for a lonely old man. I never imagined he would create all this." He gestured to the room full of people, all connected through one remarkable dog's influence. Charlie chose that moment to return to Walter's side, placing his head gently on his owner's knee. The gesture was both protective and reassuring, a reminder of the deep bond that had started this entire journey. In the weeks that followed Walter's return home, Sarah watched as the seeds of connection that Charlie had planted continued to grow and flourish. The dog's influence had created something remarkable, a network of caring that extended far beyond his initial life-saving act. Every evening after her shift, Sarah would stop by Walter's apartment, often finding it filled with visitors. The once quiet home had become a gathering place for an unlikely family of friends. Emma and her mother were regular visitors, sharing stories of her continuing recovery and the plans for their involvement in the hospital's new therapy dog program. Mrs. Henderson would bring her famous cookies, and other neighbors would drop by, each drawn by the special atmosphere that Charlie seemed to create. Charlie maintained his vigilant care of Walter while somehow making everyone feel included in his circle of protection. His ability to balance these responsibilities amazed Sarah, though according to Eleanor's research, this was exactly what made him extraordinary. His capacity to maintain multiple emotional connections without diminishing the primary bond with his owner. One evening, as the autumn light painted the room in soft golden hues, Sarah arrived to find Walter sitting in his armchair, Eleanor's research journal open in his lap, and Charlie in his usual spot by the window. The dog's ears perked up at her arrival, but his eyes remained focused on Walter. "I've been thinking," Walter said, carefully closing the journal. "Eleanor's research shouldn't just stay in these pages. Charlie has shown us how much impact one dog can have. Imagine what could happen if we shared this knowledge with others." Sarah settled into the nearby chair, noticing how Charlie shifted slightly to keep both of them in his line of sight. "The hospital board would definitely be interested," she said. "Dr. Morrison mentioned they're already seeing remarkable results from their initial therapy dog assessments." "It's more than that," Walter continued, his voice warm with purpose. "Eleanor believed dogs like Charlie could bridge the gap between medical treatment and emotional healing. She saw it as a way to make healthcare more human, more connected." As if understanding the importance of the conversation, Charlie moved from his spot by the window to sit between them, his presence adding weight to Walter's words. Sarah noticed how he positioned himself, close enough to offer comfort, but still maintaining his protective stance. "You know," Sarah said thoughtfully, "when Charlie first followed me that night, I thought he was just a stray looking for food. I never imagined he would change so many lives." Walter smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Charlie's ears. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it? One simple act of trust, a dog choosing to follow, someone he sensed could help, created all of this." The sound of voices in the hallway drew their attention. Emma had arrived for her daily visit, her wheelchair now replaced by careful steps, supported by her mother. Charlie's tail wagged, gently in greeting, but he didn't move from his position until he was sure Walter was ready for visitors. "Guess what?" Emma announced excitedly. "The hospital approved our application for the therapy dog program, and Dr. Morrison wants to use Mr. Thompson's experience with Charlie as a case study for training other handlers." As the room filled with congratulations and excited discussion, Sarah watched Charlie move among them, offering his special brand of comfort and connection to each person. She thought about that first night, about how close she had come to ignoring him, to missing out on this extraordinary journey. Walter caught her eye and smiled knowingly. "Eleanor used to say that sometimes the greatest gifts come to us in unexpected ways. We just have to be willing to trust and follow where they lead." Looking around the room at the unlikely family that had formed, the retired professor, the young patient, the caring neighbors, all brought together by one remarkable dog, Sarah understood exactly what he meant. Charlie hadn't just saved Walter's life that night. He had shown them all the healing power of connection, the extraordinary capacity of the heart to expand and embrace new bonds. As the evening light faded and the room grew warm with conversation and laughter, Charlie maintained his gentle vigilance, his presence a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come not from grand gestures or careful plans, but from simple acts of trust and the courage to follow where they lead. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Sarah, Walter, and the extraordinary Charlie has touched your hearts. This tale of unexpected connections and the healing power of companionship reminds us that sometimes the most remarkable changes in our lives come from moments we least expect. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Join our community in the comments below and share your own experiences with unexpected bonds that changed your life. Remember, sometimes the most profound connections begin with a simple act of trust.